A trawler was moving forward on the sea. Suddenly, the net seemed to hit something. Before anyone could react, the ship began to shake violently. The captain immediately fired a flare to request rescue. Just a short distance away from the trawler, there happened to be a fishing boat. Captain Andre decided to go full speed to the rescue. However, for some unknown reason, a thick fog suddenly enveloped the sea. This severely hindered the speed of the rescue. At this moment, the radio equipment on the fishing boat suddenly transmitted cries for help. Andre sensed that something was wrong. Indeed, when he arrived at the rescue location, it was already completely deserted. However, the next scene completely shocked Andre. Andre had never heard such a sound before. After returning, he immediately reported the incident. Relevant departments took this very seriously. They dispatched a marine biology expert, Abby, to take charge of the matter. The superior specifically pointed out that the accident occurred at Fane Bay. Upon hearing that name, Abby's expression instantly became serious, because that place was not only her hometown, but also Abby's place of sorrow. Returning here after many years, Abby immediately teamed up with the police officer, Ginter, to visit the local fishing company to gather information. The trawler and fishing boat both belonged to this company. Moreover, the company's leader was Abby's father. Here, Abby learned the basic details of the situation, especially about the location where the incident occurred. She then found Captain Andre to inquire about the specifics. However, she learned about the strange light phenomenon. According to Andre, it was the strangest sound he had ever heard. The intensity of the light was also very strange. He even thought it was an explosion. After understanding this basic information, Abby set off for the shipwreck location. It was located very far from the coast, with only a beacon as a marker. However, Abby was surprised to find that she had barely left the coast when she spotted the beacon. This was completely different from what she had expected. But before Abby could figure out why there was such a significant discrepancy in the location information, in the next second, her speedboat met with an accident. All electronic communication devices on the boat malfunctioned. Even the power supply to the speedboat was forcibly cut off. Moreover, Abby could clearly feel something hit the bottom of the speedboat, causing her to nearly fall into the sea. Clearly, the shipwreck wasn't that simple. However, this situation didn't last long. The equipment on the speedboat quickly resumed functionality. Abby drove the speedboat back to the port and rushed to the mayor's office. She hoped the mayor would issue an order to temporarily halt all sea travel. However, after hearing Abby's reasons, the mayor didn't take it seriously. There are many potential reasons for these phenomena. It could be due to a large proliferation of phytoplankton, or perhaps there are submarines in the vicinity, both of which could lead to inaccurate signal positioning. If it was just this kind of reason, he couldn't issue a ban on sea travel. Abby didn't get the result she wanted, but this was also within reason. She went to the local marine management authority to review the last positioning signal of the trawler. After careful examination, she was very certain that the trawler had also experienced some kind of electromagnetic interference. Therefore, its position was as inaccurate as that of the beacon. Moreover, Abby noticed that there should have been a research vessel nearby. When the trawler had its accident, perhaps they could provide information about the trawler's true sinking location. They quickly found the research vessel, and through the radar records on the ship, they went to the target area for salvage operations. However, no matter how hard the salvage team searched, they never found the wreckage of the trawler. Clearly, the research vessel's radar was also suffering from strong electromagnetic interference. However, Abby was not discouraged. She collected many seawater samples along the path of the research vessel, preparing to analyze these to determine the whereabouts of the trawler. Soon, Abby's research yielded results. She calculated a location coordinate based on sonar feedback. Then she had the salvage team go to the position Abby had calculated. They actually discovered the sunken trawler on the seabed. Just as Abby wanted to wait for the salvage operation to finish before conducting her research, a new accident suddenly occurred. That night, a cargo ship happened to pass through the area. Subsequently, an accident also occurred on the cargo ship. The relevant personnel of the Marine Administration discovered the abnormality of the cargo ship through the radar. Immediately after that, they heard the crew members on the ship sending out a distress signal. He immediately pressed the emergency alarm button. Just at this moment, a powerful light burst out in that sea area. Perhaps it was because the relevant personnel reacted in a timely manner this time, so the loss of the cargo ship was not serious. It was just that the goods in a few containers were missing. In the subsequent investigation, Abby learned a lot of details of that night, especially the fact that The radar malfunctioned again drew Abby's serious attention. Such similar situations occurring one after another made Abby believe this was definitely not a coincidence. However, before she could delve deeper into the reasons behind it, she received the notification that the sunken trawler had been salvaged. Upon hearing this news, Abby felt some confusion. Such a rapid salvage process clearly defied logic. Later, Abby learned that military personnel were involved in the salvage operation. However, this raised more questions. Why were military personnel getting involved? After seeing the wreckage, Abby gained some understanding of the reasons involved. According to the salvage workers' account, the trawler was only half of its original structure when it was salvaged. Furthermore, based on the breakage patterns observed, it appeared that some tremendous force had suddenly snapped the trawler in half. But that was simply impossible. Neither the pressure of the water flow nor the vibrations that night were sufficient to tear steel apart instantaneously. Upon hearing this information, Abby started to formulate some hypotheses to prevent any further accidents. She immediately summoned the townspeople. Most of them were fishermen or sailors who lived by the sea, yet Abby advised everyone not to go out to sea for a while to avoid danger. Faced with such a request, questions were immediately raised by some. They asked Abby what the source of the danger was. However, Abby herself didn't have a clear understanding, so she could only speak the truth. Upon hearing such an answer, the crowd immediately changed their attitude. They scoffed at Abby's words and began to leave the meeting. Abby's father was among them as well. However, before he left, he gave Abby some advice that she should gather enough evidence before returning. With even her father not believing her, Abby felt an overwhelming sense of disappointment. Just then, a woman expressed her support for Abby. Her name was Sylvia, and she was Abby's sister-in-law. She was also a staunch environmentalist. She had always believed that humans shouldn't interfere excessively with nature. Abby's current proposal aligned perfectly with Sylvia's beliefs, so she decided to help Abby find evidence. To figure out what caused the equipment failure on the boat, Abby and Ginter arrived at the area where accidents frequently occurred, then deployed 2 robots into the water for exploration. At this moment, another accident happened. The 2 robots had only been in the water for a short while before losing contact. In the last images transmitted from the robots, Abby and Ginter saw there appeared to be something on the seabed, but it was very blurry, and they couldn't discern what it specifically was. Immediately following that, the speedboat they were on, just like before, suddenly had all its equipment shut down. Even the power supply system ceased to function. She planned to wait for it to naturally recover, but was horrified to see a whirlpool suddenly appear not far from the speedboat, and it was gradually moving closer to the speedboat. With the boat now powerless, it was impossible to escape the whirlpool. Just when Abby thought her life was about to come to an end, she fatally heard a strange sound. Immediately after that, the approaching whirlpool instantly vanished, as if everything that had just happened was merely a figment of Abby's imagination. Yet both on the boat were certain that they had walked through the gates of death. Once the boat's systems recovered, they quickly packed their things and returned to port. They dared not linger in this eerie sea for a moment longer. Abby believed that the bizarre scene they had just witnessed was most likely a warning from the unseen force behind it all, so Abby immediately reported the matter upon returning. However, her superiors didn't believe there was any hidden force after listening. They thought it was simply a normal natural phenomenon. In fact, these phenomena did resemble the characteristics of underwater earthquakes. However, Abby believed this was far from ordinary geological activity, but the area had very strong electromagnetic interference, which made it impossible to obtain any information with robots. After much hesitation, Abby decided to dive into the depths herself to investigate. So the next day, Abby donned a full diving suit and returned to that area once more. She jumped into the sea alone, following the ship's anchor chain downwards. Before long, she arrived at the seabed area. She remarkably discovered a fissure in the seabed there. Perhaps all of this was indeed caused by an underwater earthquake. Abby returned to the boat with some disappointment, ready to tell Ginter about her discovery. However, Ginter's phone was always unanswered. Left with no choice, Abby could only return to port. In reality, Ginter was not far from her position. Not long ago, the extreme environmentalist Sylvia came to this area to help Abby gather evidence, and she chose to dive into the sea for the investigation. Unlike Abby's discovered fissure, Sylvia's findings were even more shocking. She discovered a large number of bombs on the seabed. Upon learning this, Officer Ginter immediately led a team to handle the situation. Soon after, they located Sylvia and the others. Ginter and his companions then donned diving suits to conduct an investigation. Underwater, at this moment, Sylvia was photographing the bombs with her companions. However, the next moment, she saw a sudden burst of bright light in the water. Immediately after, the underwater bombs were detonated all at once. Such a violent noise caught Abby's attention, who was not far away. She drove the speedboat over to investigate. After much effort, she managed to rescue Sylvia, but she learned from a nearby officer that Ginter and the others were also in the water. Abby hurriedly re-entered the water, searching for Ginter's figure. However, due to the explosion, the water was filled with debris, and visibility was greatly reduced. Abby gave it her all but couldn't find Ginter. His fate was already predictable. Soon after, Ginter was killed in the line of duty. Abby went to the hospital, hoping to learn more about the specific circumstances from Sylvia. However, due to orders from above, Abby didn't get to see Sylvia. At this moment, she noticed a woman sneaking around the hospital, and the moment Abby caught sight of her, the woman immediately took off running. Abby was convinced that the woman must know something. Without hesitation, she chased after her. However, Abby was unable to catch up with her, but she had memorized the woman's appearance, so it wasn't long before Abby found information about the woman. The woman was named Laura. Abby found Laura and asked her why she had been sneaking around the hospital. According to Laura, she was also there to find Sylvia. However, she hoped to obtain the photos Sylvia had taken, to prove that the area was indeed filled with dangers, so that the government would halt the current development projects. Hearing this, Abby pressed for more details, and learned the government intended to build wind turbines in that area. However, it was no longer needed, because following the explosion, the entire sea area had been sealed off. As a result, the construction of wind turbines was also cancelled. Upon hearing this, Abby instantly felt that something was wrong. She sought out the mayor to request authorization to pass through the blockade, but was told that it was impossible, because it was a decision made by the national government. As a mere mayor, he had no authority to interfere. If they couldn't access the sea, it would be impossible to investigate the cause of the explosion. Left with no choice, Abby decided to sneak out. She contacted Captain Andre to ask if the small fishing boat was still in the warehouse. Then the two secretly set out to sea with the boat to conduct their investigation. When they arrived at the target sea area, Abby deployed a sonar detection device into the water, then began to record various sounds. Moments later, the previously calm sea suddenly produced a discordant audio. Following that, tremors began to ripple through the nearby waters. This was the result Abby had hoped for. She immediately ruled out the possibility of an earthquake, based on the waveforms she received. But before she could further her research, a team of soldiers quickly approached them. Abby hurriedly removed the storage card from the device. She was then taken away by the soldiers. Soon after, Abby was brought to the military camp at the port. There, she met a commander named Helen. Helen claimed that they had been monitoring Abby, and knew she was investigating the underwater tremors. Helen stated that they wouldn't prevent Abby from conducting her research. On the contrary, they even wanted to collaborate with Abby to analyze the reasons more quickly. However, Abby didn't trust the military personnel, so she casually made up a reason to decline Helen's invitation. But how could the military easily give up? So although they officially released Abby, in reality, when Abby returned to her place, she found that all her research materials had been taken by the military. In comparison, Andre, who was involved, was completely ignored by the military. After he left the military camp, he immediately gathered some friends to investigate the underwater situation. The two assistants he recruited were Communications Officer Laura and Joseph, a teacher from the small town. By analyzing the current information, they believed that all the previous events were related to that bright light. Laura pulled out a video, which showed footage of the cargo ship's incident, captured from the lighthouse. In addition to the bright light, they found that a child had also witnessed the bizarre scene. Joseph recognized that the child was Jimmy, one of his students. He had been present at the scene and must know something. Soon, Jimmy was brought into the group. Because he was naturally deaf and mute, he could only express his feelings from that day through drawing and sign language. From this, they learned that, after the bright light appeared, Jimmy had felt a subtle vibration. Moreover, the light wasn't constant, but pulsed in a rhythmic manner, like breathing. On the other side, although Abby had lost her research equipment, the most important audio tape was still in her possession. She borrowed someone else's computer to export the audio, and discovered that it seemed to be an animal's call. Just then, Laura suddenly arrived at her place, and abruptly threw Abby's phone onto the bed, then grabbed her and started to walk outside. When they reached outside the door, Laura carefully checked the car's undercarriage with a mirror to make sure there were no TR lowering devices. Abby didn't understand why Laura was being so secretive, but in the next moment, she saw a military vehicle in the direction where Laura was looking. Clearly, they weren't satisfied with just taking her research equipment, but were constantly monitoring her. It was nearly impossible for her to escape under their watchful eyes. However, Laura and the others were well prepared. Moments later, a white vehicle quietly appeared behind the military vehicle. Laura swiftly drove Abby away towards the back of the military vehicle. Just as they were about to pursue, the vehicle behind blocked their way. Soon after, Laura brought Abby to their base. There, she met Andre and the others. When he saw the boy, Jimmy, Abby reacted particularly excitedly, because Jimmy was her son. Afterwards, Abby learned through Andre and the others' accounts that they suspected that a certain sea monster was responsible for the incident. It must be said that this was indeed a possibility. Abby looked at the photo of the bright light, recalling some of her past experiences. She had once recorded a special audio in the Mariana Trench, which was very similar to what she had previously recorded. Abby suspected it might be emitted by the same type of creature. Then she played her previously recorded audio for Andre and the others, asking them to think and analyze the source of the sound together. But before they could reach a conclusion, Laura made a new discovery. She had been monitoring the military's radio signals, and just now, she received a sudden message. The military had finally located the black box from the trawler, preparing to have experts decode the data within it, to clarify what had happened at that time. However, this matter was highly confidential. The military didn't allow local researchers to participate, and planned to find someone from outside. Laura saw this as an opportunity, so she immediately contacted Abby to explain her plan. Although the plan was very risky, Abby felt it was feasible. Abby disguised herself as a researcher hired by the military, and arrived at the camp. With the help of Laura's forged identity, she surprisingly managed to pass through undetected, and accessed the black box from the trawler. Abby immediately took out her computer to start decoding the information inside. Before long, she found the last segment of data recorded before the trawler's incident. It contained an audio segment. What astonished Abby even more was that this audio was completely identical to the one she had recorded earlier. It was the owner of this audio who had caused the trawler to sink. However, Abby's current situation was extremely precarious. She noticed that shadows of many soldiers had suddenly appeared outside the tent. She immediately realized she had been compromised, and hurriedly packed her things to prepare for an escape. However, they were clearly well prepared. As soon as Abby stepped out of the tent, several military personnel were already waiting there. Abby had no opportunity to escape. She was once again arrested by the military, and was escorted in front of Commander Helen. As before, she requested Abby to cooperate with them. Abby still showed great resistance, but Helen's next words left her stunned, because Helen used all the residents of the town as leverage, coercing her to comply. Abby could only say she would think about it. After a night of contemplation, Abby ultimately decided to cooperate with the military, to jointly investigate the source of the bright light. Of course, she also made her own demands. She insisted on researching alongside Andre and the others. This was not a major issue. With the military's cooperation, Abby's investigation progressed significantly faster. She used the military's remote-controlled equipment to easily enter the dangerous sea area. Soon, they discovered something in the water. Abby quickly transmitted her previously recorded audio to the drone, and used the drone's light to send signals to the mysterious shadow. However, after several attempts, there was no response from the other side. In the control room, Abby and the others fell into silence. They began to doubt whether their previous research was incorrect. Just when she didn't know what to do, Joseph from the team suggested that perhaps Abby could try transmitting the audio recorded years ago in the Mariana Trench to see what would happen. Abby again instructed the drone to send signals based on the audio from years ago. To her surprise, it actually worked. The previously silent screen suddenly displayed a dazzling light. It was exactly the same as in the previous video. However, at this moment, the drone suddenly lost control, and quickly moved toward the source of the light. It turned out that the military didn't trust Abby and the others at all. Seeing that the research had yielded results, Helen immediately ordered her subordinates to take control of the drone, preparing to approach and carefully study the source of the light. However, the position they had previously controlled was at the boundary of a strong electromagnetic zone. As Helen and the others forcibly approached, they lost contact with the drone in the next second, and because of Helen's reckless actions, the mysterious creature would likely not respond to them again. Abby blamed everything on Helen. She then left the military camp and headed to the local hospital. She had just received word that Sylvia had finally woken up from her coma. Now she might be the only breakthrough. Abby impatiently asked Sylvia what had happened in the deep sea, and why the explosion had occurred suddenly. After a brief moment of thought, Sylvia revealed that she had been taking pictures of the underwater bombs with her camera, but suddenly she felt a vibration behind her. When she turned around, she saw a brilliant light. Immediately afterwards, the bombs exploded. Other than that, she remembered nothing else. After hearing Sylvia's account, Abby immediately noticed the key point. She had used the camera as a lighting system. Based on Sylvia's account, Abby speculated that the creature in the deep sea was very sensitive to light. Perhaps the drone was destroyed by the creature due to the bright light, and Sylvia was targeted because of the flash from her camera. This made many things make sense. However, Abby still had a few questions. First, why had this creature only recently started attacking ships? She had a faint suspicion. Perhaps this creature had only arrived here recently. Otherwise, based on its nature, this port town would have been leveled long ago. To understand why it had suddenly come here, Abby decided to contact the sea monster again. Moreover, considering that the creature was sensitive to light, she specifically chose not to use the drone equipment this time. Instead, she opted for diving to get close to the monster. Soon after, Abby and Andre arrived at the dangerous sea area. Under Andre's watchful gaze, Abby decisively jumped into the sea, then swam down toward the bottom. After an unknown period of time, she once again saw that mysterious underwater fissure. However, this time, Abby noticed that there was a strong light emanating from within the fissure. She deduced that this was the hiding place of the sea monster. So Abby cautiously approached. To her surprise, she indeed discovered a strange creature. However, it was very small in size. Moreover, it was trapped in a fishing net. It looked to be in very bad condition. Just as Abby submerged into the fissure, a massive creature immediately noticed the small boat on the surface of the sea. In an instant, the entire sea surface surged upwards, creating a tsunami several meters high. Andre, who was on the boat, had given up struggling and was prepared for death. But in the blink of an eye, the raging tsunami vanished. It was as if everything that had just happened was merely Andre's hallucination. In reality, the giant creature had noticed the changes in the underwater fissure. Abby dove deeper into the fissure and immediately understood the sequence of events. She quickly took action to help the strange creature free itself from the tangled net. However, because she didn't have any professional equipment, the process was very slow. Even after spending a long time, she was unable to rescue the mysterious creature. As time went on, the creature became increasingly weak. Finally, it closed its eyes forever. Abby was heartbroken over this, but there was no time for her to grieve now. Abby noticed that a massive creature was quickly approaching above the fissure. She hurriedly swam upwards, wanting to leave the area. However, she was one step too late. By the time Abby left the fissure, the surrounding waters suddenly became incredibly turbulent. She couldn't maintain her form at all. Ultimately, she was swept away by the violent currents. Her head struck a reef, and she instantly lost consciousness. When Abby woke up again, she didn't know how much time had passed. At this point, the water flow had returned to calm. However, she was too weak to swim to the surface. To make matters worse, she noticed a strong light suddenly appearing not far from her. Obviously, the sea monster hadn't left. In this critical moment, Andre, who was waiting on the boat, suddenly appeared and pulled Abby from the depths. Once below on the boat, Abby finally managed to remove her hood. At this point, her head was already covered in blood. If it hadn't been for Andre, she would have certainly died in the sea. The two quickly returned to the port. Andre proudly recounted to his wife the experiences he shared with Abby at sea, especially about encountering the luminous sea monster and rescuing Abby from the creature's grasp. For a moment, Andre received countless praises. However, among the crowd of onlookers, one sailor's reaction was quite unusual. On the other side, Abby quickly returned to her residence after getting back to the port. She was now filled with guilt and fear. Abby believed that if she could have discovered it earlier, perhaps they could have rescued the mysterious creature, and they wouldn't have encountered the subsequent violent currents. But there are no what-ifs in reality. Andre's story was soon learned by the military. They analyzed the recent data and concluded that the sea monster's strength seemed to be weakening. Helen decided to mobilize the military to capture the sea monster. In stark contrast, after recovering her emotions, Abby decided to rescue the sea monster. She also noticed its weakness, and speculated that the creature might have gotten lost for some reason, accidentally arriving at the town. Then, it might have collided with a dragger that struck the young creature, making it unable to leave for the time being. Moreover, the environment near the town wasn't suitable for the giant creature's survival. If it wasn't sent away soon, it could lead to unpredictable consequences. According to Abby's plan, they would retrieve marine life audio, and then communicate with the sea monster. This would encourage it to leave willingly. However, this plan was disrupted by an unexpected individual. It was the sailor. After hearing Andre's account, he immediately organized a team. Ignoring the military blockade, they forced their way out of the harbor to hunt the sea monster. Because there had been the sailor's good brother on the sunken dragger, he swore to take revenge for him. This news quickly reached Abby and her companions. She saw the situation at the harbor through surveillance, and immediately went with several companions to stop the sailor. The military also dispatched a small team, but this was merely to prevent the sailors from disturbing the monster and causing the plan to fail. Soon, the military caught up with the sailors. They threatened the fishing boat with force to turn around immediately, or they would clear out a few of them. The sailors were filled with resentment over this, but in the next second, the soldiers suddenly withdrew, which left the sailors puzzled. In reality, this was an order given by Helen. She wasn't being merciful, but rather had noticed that the sea monster was leading the sailors towards a minefield area. If the soldiers did not hastily retreat, they would likely perish in the sea along with them. Meanwhile, Abby and her companions were puzzled when they saw the military soldiers retreating. However, after glancing at the navigation, she immediately understood the reason. The people on the fishing boat were already very close to the explosion zone. If they didn't stop now, they would undoubtedly die. Her companions wanted to use the radio to contact the fishing boat ahead, but at this moment, the sailor was blinded by hatred, and had even turned off the radio communication device. Just when Abby didn't know what to do, the surface of the sea nearby suddenly changed. Upon seeing the massive body of the monster, the sailor could no longer think about revenge. However, it was already too late. He and Abby's group had already entered the minefield. Any slight movement could provoke a violent attack from the monster. If that happened, it would trigger the underwater explosives, and they would all die a terrible death. Before they could figure out how to escape, suddenly there was a collision felt from beneath the boat. They were horrified to discover that the monster was right beneath them. This was undoubtedly bad news. Based on the information they had previously gathered, the monster would release energy at night. If Abby and the others hadn't managed to evacuate by then, the outcome would only be death at sea. The military and Andre's group also noticed the situation over there. They each took different courses of action. Andre and his companions quickly went to the lighthouse. According to Abby's previous plan, they intended to communicate with the monster to encourage it to leave voluntarily. However, because they hadn't figured out which frequency to use, they were making no progress. On the military side, their approach was much more straightforward and violent. Helen dispatched a warship, preparing to capture the monster alive. Therefore, her primary task was to stabilize the giant creature. She told Abby that the destroyer would arrive in 2 hours, and urged her not to panic. At this moment, both sides were racing against time to act. Abby noticed that the sea monster wasn't responding. She immediately contacted her companions at the lighthouse, and personally directed them on how to proceed. This action naturally did not escape the military's notice. Helen quickly arranged for her subordinates to deal with the people in the lighthouse. The soldiers hadn't yet approached the lighthouse. When Laura saw them on the surveillance, Laura immediately requested reinforcements from his other companions, so Jimmy suddenly appeared before the gathered residents, and used sign language to send a request to them. The crowd quickly hurried towards the lighthouse. The soldiers who came to drive them away hadn't dealt with Andre and others. When they noticed more residents continuously joining the crowd of resistance, they were very determined in their stance. The soldiers couldn't advance even a step. Seeing this situation, Helen immediately ordered reinforcements, and also allowed them to arrest the obstructors. Meanwhile, the villagers had their own countermeasures. They live-streamed the situation online. The visuals of the conflict between the military and civilians quickly attracted a large number of viewers. However, even so, the leading officer remained determined. Seeing this situation, Jimmy rallied many of his friends. They formed a human wall composed of children, standing in the front row. The leading officer had to give up, forcefully breaking through. However, things were not improving on Abby's side. AK had tried many audio frequencies, but still couldn't establish contact with the monster, until a moment arrived, when Abby suddenly heard what seemed to be a sorrowful howl from the monster. Even she was affected by the emotion in it. In that moment, Abby had an inspiration. Perhaps communicating with the monster didn't require a specific frequency. She contacted Laura at the lighthouse and asked her to play music that could touch the heart. Upon hearing this strange request, Laura was unsure what kind of music to choose. Just as both sides were at a standstill, a companion beside Abby said that he had such music on his phone. As the man played the music from his phone, the pain deep within Abby was suddenly evoked, because this melody was composed by her. In fact, the man beside her was Abby's husband. They had once had a son together, but he passed away at a very young age. Abby composed this piano piece in memory of him. Perhaps the sea monster sensed the sorrow within it. It actually began to move slowly. However, it didn't go far before stopping again. Not far away, the military ship could be seen. Abby immediately made a bold decision. She jumped into the water, ready to communicate with the monster up close. This was her first time seeing the form shrouded in bright light. Abby took off her gloves and gently stroked the sea monster. In an instant, it seemed that a connection was established between them. They felt each other's intentions. Moments later, the monster set off again. The military ship nearby attempted to intervene, but in the next second, all the equipment on the ship malfunctioned. In the end, Helen and her group could only watch as the mysterious creature disappeared from view. Abby and her companions safely returned to the harbor. The film comes to an end here. The film Crack was shot in France. As a fantasy film, the theme of sea monsters isn't particularly novel. It can even be said to be somewhat cliched. The plot of the film can only be described as average. It's a rather ordinary film. If the audience has any other opinions, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoy my channel, please subscribe to it. Your likes, comments, and follows are the best encouragement for us. See you in the next episode.